I would like to introduce to you as our panel moderator, good friend of mine for many, many years here in Minnesota, Thomas Hanson. And you have Thomas' bio, but I just would have my pleasure to read a couple of sentences from his own very richful international background, and some of this related to Russia as well. Okay, we don't have any PowerPoint for this, okay. Thomas Hanson is a foreign policy consultant and former U.S. Foreign Service officer whose posting included East Germany, France, Norway, and Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He also participated in opening a new U.S. embassy in Mongolia, Estonia, worked in the foreign relations committees at the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and served as a director for NATO and Eastern European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of United States in Washington, D.C. Goes on and on and on. So many very important, high-ranking diplomatic posts and positions that we are all happy to have Thomas with us today. And Thomas, please join us on the podium. And you have a panel, and panelists are in front of you. I believe you will be introducing your panel. Tom, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nikolai. So, well, it's a real pleasure to be here today and to head up this panel. I found the first part of the morning incredibly informative and excellent, and I want to thank all the organizers for making this possible. What we're going to be looking at in this panel will be sort of a hands-on approach from different perspectives. I will do a sort of an introductory set of remarks about the overall political situation between the United States and Russia and where this may be going. But then we'll get into the real meat of the program with our panelists. First with Perry Davis, who special agent with the U.S. Department of Commerce at the Bureau of Industry and Security. And he will talk about some of the hands-on, day-to-day operations that he's responsible for. Then Michael Brown, who is Vice President of International Sales for Made Precision Tools and has a lot of experience dealing with export-import to Russia. We'll hear his perspectives. And then we're very happy to have with us Leo Grichener, who is the Vice President of the Russian-American Business Association of Minnesota, which is a fairly new organization. As you know, there's a large Russian-speaking community in the Twin Cities, and Leo will describe for us sort of what's happening in that community and the possible assets that are there within that community for anybody thinking of doing business over in Russia. And then finally, very happy to see with us Todd Lefko, one of the most experienced Minnesotans in relations, trade relations with Russia, president of the International Business Development Company Incorporated, has been working for 29 years on export-import to Russia. And as you probably saw in his bio, he has authored 600 articles in Russian newspapers over the years. He's very well known over there and here in Minnesota. So we're looking forward to all of their comments from their own perspectives. What we'll do is we'll each make a brief set of remarks, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion at the end. So first, I'd like to start just offering a few reflections on where we are with relations with Russia today. Our topic today is sanctions, and in fact, sanctions have been a constant in U.S. policy toward Russia for the past 40 years. I was active in the State Department during the Kissinger years at the time of détente, when the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the Trade Act of 1974 instituted de facto sanctions on Russia, denying them most favored nation status over the issue of Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. Now, since 1975, and especially since Gorbachev, 500,000 Russian Jews have migrated to the U.S. I think we have up to 60,000 here in the Twin Cities, and 1 million to Israel. So the issue was basically solved. But the Jackson-Vanik Amendment stayed in place for decades. And only in 2012 was it finally lifted within the context of the Russian and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal and Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, which lifted Jackson-Vanik but put in place new sanctions against Russia because of the death of Sergei Magnitsky, a tax lawyer who had been researching corruption in Russia. Now, so those sanctions led to the abortion ban from Russia and to the sanctioning of 18 U.S. officials, mostly U.S. attorneys, and DEA special agents. And of course, now this 2012 measure has been followed up, as we've heard today, in March 2014, with a new set of sanctions by executive order, and now in July 2017, action by Congress. This, in fact, was an unprecedented step, not just making these sanctions law, but making law that only Congress can lift them. This is a real example of congressional assertion within our balance of powers. So it is likely the sanctions are going to get worse, very possibly, and of course it all depends on the politics. What does Russia want right now? What is driving their actions? Well, there are competing anecdotes, competing analyses. The anecdote we always hear is the Putin statement that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of modern times. But there's another quote that you hear more often in Russia, which was also from Putin, to the effect that anyone who has a heart cannot help but lament the demise of the Soviet Union. Anyone with a head would not think of trying to restore it. Which is it? And on Ukraine, is Putin trying to restore the Soviet Union? As Senator Mark Warner said in Congress just recently, Russia seeks to undermine democracy now wherever it exists, another worldwide challenge. Or are they focused on Ukraine? Is this an issue? In 2004, when Putin had been in for 4 years, Russia accepted the Baltic states coming into NATO. But they began signaling here and no further. Not Ukraine, not Georgia, into NATO. Now, if that's the analysis, then they make a distinction between Ukraine and the other members of NATO. Which is it? As opinions are divided about which Russia we're dealing with here. Does Putin want merely a federated Ukraine, which will have votes for the East, which would block NATO membership? Does he want a formal treaty making Ukraine neutral? Does he want what they call Novaya Russia, which would be an expansion way into Ukraine, further military expansion? These are the issues we're trying to deal with. Now, I want to make a very basic point. Russia today is not the old Soviet Union. Russia today is punching way above its weight. If you look at statistics from the last years of the Soviet Union compared to Russia today, in GDP, the Russian economy was about 35% of the U.S. economy. Today, it's 18-1, the U.S. economy, stronger than the Russian economy. The Russian economy is about half of what it was under the Soviet Union. Defense spending was almost 90%. Russia was spending about 90% of what the U.S. spent. Today, it's about between 9 and 10-1 U.S. defense spending over. This is not the same country that we were dealing with in the Cold War. And a DIA report came out just in June. It's unclassified. There's a classified version as well, saying that their assessment is that the Russian government today perceives that the U.S. is seeking regime change through sanctions. That the ultimate goal of U.S. sanctions, as they are tightened and tightened and tightened, is to actually bring down the Putin government. Is this the case? Probably not from our point of view, but if this is the way the Russians perceive it, it certainly makes a difference. Now, final point. In addition to these uncertainties, the West, much more than it seems on the surface, is divided about how to go forward with Russia. In Germany, for example, in 2008, the German government vetoed at 2 NATO summits extension of membership action program to Ukraine and Georgia, saying we've pushed Russia far enough with NATO expansion. This led to a huge crisis between the German government at the time and the George W. Bush regime. And after Ukraine, after 2014, the three previous chancellors of Germany expressed understanding for what the Russians were doing, surprisingly and even shockingly. Angela Merkel has made it clear this is all about values, and we're not about to make deals over the heads of the Ukrainians. But opinions are deeply divided on this question. If François Fillon, who was the leading candidate in France until a scandal brought him down, had become president, he would have changed France's policy on Russia. If you look at Greece, I was just in Hungary recently, much of a pro-Russian policy is developing, very different from Poland and Estonia. So that NATO within itself is divided, and the US is sending very mixed signals under Donald Trump. Kurt Volker, the new special envoy for Ukraine, is pushing for increased offensive military sales to Ukraine. This is a very popular position in Congress. John McCain and others, I think even Amy Klobuchar is on board for this. And yet Trump is reportedly consulting intensively with Henry Kissinger. He's had Kissinger do major diplomatic forays for him on China and Russia. And what Kissinger is telling Trump is, we do not want to push Russia into the arms of China, especially now that China is launching this One Belt, One Road, huge economic juggernaut across Eurasia. We've got to separate out the weaker partner. And he is reportedly advocating a treaty like the Austria Treaty of 1955, which made Austria neutral, unable to join NATO, but able to trade in all directions. Which way is it going to go? I would just say one final thing. This is all up in the air. It makes it very hard for anybody doing business to know where this larger constellation of forces will go. I'm just back from a conference in the UK where one of the key topics was the role of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which is under assault right now, as you probably know, in Congress. And it just seems to me that there's a pattern right now in our country at a time when we want to create jobs of limiting our ability to export by not allowing export guarantees, export subsidies, and perhaps in the case of Russia too, we may be paying a price on the sanctions because other countries are filling in where we could be there. So anyway, these are all very divisive issues, very political, but I just thought I'd trace for you the landscape, which, as I say, is more complicated than it looks on the surface. So with that brief statement, I'll turn the floor over now to Perry Davis, and we'll begin our first hands-on presentations. Perry?
Thank you. As my bio mentions and has been stated, I'm a special agent with the Bureau of Industry and Security. And I want to just say a couple brief things about BIS before I get started. It's a big agency, but it's made up really of kind of three primary sections. One would be people that work on policy issues, also licensing officers, and then the third area being enforcement. So the enforcement branch is where I sit and what my activities involve. What that means is, perhaps a disappointment to some of you, I'm not an expert in Russia sanctions. BIS has experts, and there's probably a couple experts in this room. I'm not one of them. I'm familiar with the regulations, and as you can probably guess, when you're dealing with export controls, look at the sanctions that are involved with Russia, apply that to half a dozen different sanctioned countries, and then take into consideration the regular regulations that apply to what you're shipping, where you're shipping it to. You're talking about a broad set of regulations. And as I said, we have policy people in Washington that are experts. I've been in BIS for a long time, and I generally know who they are and can direct questions to them when need be. When enforcement agents like myself become an expert in some specific section of the regulations, it's when they're dealing with a case that involves those types of issues. So I think, take it as a piece of good news for Minnesota experts, or for Minnesota exporters. I'm not an expert in Russian sanctions. meaning I haven't dealt in this area very much. Before I came today, I wanted to look at just very briefly exports from Minnesota to Russia. So I reviewed them briefly, and I want to talk about just a few broad generalities there. And I also looked at BIS license activity for Minnesota companies applying for licenses to Russia. Again, just for really for my own general information, but I thought it might be of interest to you as well. Again, it was a superficial review, not scientific in nature, and it was just kind of for my own information, but there were what seemed to me some kind of broad generalities. One of which is, basically I looked at probably a couple hundred of the most recent exports from Minnesota to Russia. One of the things that jumped out at me was you're really talking about just probably several companies that constituted most of those exports. So repeat exporters, and most of those companies would be names that you'd probably all be familiar with if we went through who they are. Most of them were familiar to me and would be familiar to the enforcement community, not because they've had problems or issues, but because they're companies that we've had contact with over the years. And generally speaking, they've got good, solid export compliance programs in place. Most of the types of commodities that appeared that were being exported were what I would characterize as less sensitive items. Basically, under the commerce regulations, those would be items that are classified EAR 99, or items that, if they're on the commerce control list, were controlled for lower level types of reasons. And if you're interested in exporting to Russia, or anywhere for that matter, and you're not familiar with what I'm talking about when I say EAR 99 or the commerce control list, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I didn't come empty-handed. I brought along a little folder with some BIS information. Has our website in there, and I'd encourage you to go to our website and surf around and meet me afterwards, and I could point you to some good tutorials in there on basic export controls. Regarding licenses, again, I looked at kind of the most recent set of licenses, and it mirrors what you see in the exports, and that is that there were not a lot of license applications for sensitive items. The license applications that I saw were more related to Minnesota companies with concerns about perhaps the end user that they're dealing with, or the end use that was going to take place in Russia, and they wanted commerce and the interagency review of those transactions. Moving on to kind of the heart of what I wanted to talk about, and that is the enforcement community and our general concerns related to exports to Russia. Again, I'm going to speak in pretty broad generalities, and what I'm speaking about really are concerns that are more nationwide than Minnesota specific. There's probably been an increase in Russia-related investigations over the last few years, but it might surprise some of you to learn that I still would not say that there are top-tier type of investigation that we're conducting. I see more frequently cases involving the Iran sanctions or exports to Iran or China. Russia-related violations are probably somewhere lower down the line, around third in frequency. How are investigations, and when I talk about investigations, I think Larry mentioned there are really two different kind of investigations we might be looking at. One would be a civil investigation that can still result in fines, penalties, and forfeitures, and the other type of investigation would be criminal. In BIS, we're involved in both of those type of investigations, but I probably focus much more of my time and energy, as do agents nationwide, on criminal investigations. The joint investigations I'm involved with other agencies here in Minnesota, and those agencies would be Homeland Security and the FBI. We all work together frequently on these type of investigations. Most of what we're looking at is criminal. And I'm going to try to just very briefly talk about a few criminal investigations that have taken place and what their relevance to you or your interest might be. The really kind of two broad categories of violations we see would be violations that involve exports to either the entity list or denied persons or these sanctioned entities that we've been talking about. I think as Larry mentioned, those types of violations are most often going to result in some sort of civil investigation. I too agree that no company or person in this room is probably likely to ever be involved in any sort of criminal investigation. People that are operating that way don't tend to come to these types of events. However, as you're going to see when I talk about these cases, it doesn't mean those things might not touch on you, because the people that are involved in that type of activity are frequently concealing who they are, what they're doing, and they wind up procuring goods from U.S. companies that are unaware of what's taking place. But as I said, the most common types of violations we see would be what I would call an administrative error or lack of knowledge of what you're really doing, and you wind up exporting to someone that's on one of those lists. In the more broad enforcement community concern related to exports to Russia, I would say is probably military end use, is something that in the enforcement community as a whole is a hotter topic for us. Companies in Russia are sometimes involved in both civilian and military programs, and it's those types of end users that wind up being problematic and I think require a lot of due diligence if you're going to be dealing with one of them. These types of violations that I'm talking about, or these types of investigations, frequently would involve electronic parts and components, and usually towards the more sensitive things. And they will frequently involve shell companies or front companies or middlemen who may portray themselves as the end user when in fact they are not. BIS has what I think is some pretty good Russia-specific due diligence guidance on our website. And this pamphlet that I mentioned has our website in there. I have a pile of them up on the front desk here. I encourage everybody to take one. Also, right next to them is one of my business cards, and you can take one of those as well. You can surf around in there, but it's basically Russia-specific due diligence that you'll find. And I think that it's under the policy guidance section on the front page of our website. Echoing what's kind of in there and what Larry and I think both Matt said from an enforcement point of view, one of our mantras that we try to continually preach to industry when we get a chance to talk to exporters is know your customer. In its basic, most simplest form, that entails a lot of different things, but know who you're dealing with and know what they're going to be doing with your items. Moving on real briefly, I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to hit very briefly on these four cases that I found. And what I'm going to talk about are four criminal cases, and each one of them I was not involved in, and in fact they were really more focused out of Texas and the New York area. But if you're interested in learning more about these, all of these came out of press releases that can be found on the BIS website. The first one involved a man named Peter Zuccarelli, operating out of Plano, Texas. He recently pled guilty to exporting radiation-hardened integrated circuits to both Russia and China. And these items had both military and space applications. And he purchased these from U.S. companies, and he lied and deceived the U.S. companies about what he was going to do with these items. He provided false statements about end users, created false paperwork and documentation. This is a very recent plea. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but he's looking at some pretty serious jail time and potential fines. And this case and one other one I'm going to talk about are a little bit out of the ordinary in that you had this U.S. party really being this procurement arm and procuring in the U.S. and lying to the companies about what he was doing. A similar one was an individual named Vladimir Nedovez. And I'll probably butcher any pronunciations like that, but this gentleman, the first gentleman was a citizen of the U.S. Vladimir Nedovez is a permanent resident of the U.S. and a citizen of the Ukraine. He's been charged with illegally exporting military technology to the Ukraine. And these goods were primarily night vision equipment and thermal imaging weapons type sites. And in the same basic scenario, he bought these goods from U.S. companies and concealed the fact that he wasn't a U.S. citizen, which would have made a difference in some of the items he was procuring. And he also concealed the fact that he was going to be exporting these type of items. He too is has not been sentenced, but is looking at some serious jail time and fines. And again, he concealed all these activities from the U.S. companies. I think I'm going to skip the next two because I don't want to take too much time. But they're similar cases. And the takeaway from all of these cases, and again, if you were interested or you wanted to look at them, there's press releases on our website. The takeaway from all those cases from an enforcement agent's point of view is that there are bad guys out there. It's not an academic exercise when we talk about this. There are bad guys out there and organizations out there, both domestically and overseas, that will in fact lie to you about who they are and what they're doing. And they're very willing and able to use front companies and provide false documentation. And what that means is due diligence is extremely important when you're making these exports. Another one of my standard pitches is that we like to do these kind of presentations because I like to try to combat the idea that enforcement is the boogeyman. We're not. We're on your side. And we want to develop a partnership with industry so that when the exporters like yourselves that are interested in complying and learning what they need to do, when you see or come across a problem or an issue, you know who to contact if need be, and we want to help you with your due diligence and with your enforcement, or rather with your compliance programs. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'm probably a couple minutes over.
Thanks.
But
Thank you, Perry, very much. Thanks. And great. We will now turn to Michael Brown from Mate Precision Tooling with some practical considerations on dealing with Russia.
Thank you, Perry. Again, you're talking about investigations in a room full of lawyers. I'm not quite sure how much I really want to talk. I'll turn it over to Leo on that. But again, working...
Not the boogeyman.
I've worked in the international marketplace for the last 20 years of my career, most recently with the Anderson Corporation, exporting window and door products all over the world, including Russia. Most recently with Mate Precision Tooling. I've had 2.5 years of experience in Russia building our distribution from 1-channel partner to 5-channel partners over the last 2.5 years in Russia. With that experience, Mate is a small Minnesota manufacturing company. We're 350 people. It's a privately owned company. The son of the founder, Dean Sundquist, is still our CEO and very active in the business. Very focused on growing our international presence around the world, including Russia and Ukraine. And international, being 50% of our business, is a primary focus. So staying on top of these types of issues with sanctions and where we can and can't sell is very important to us. We recently had a dealer meeting, and we sell our products internationally through a dealer model. So we try and think globally but act locally with our local dealers and work with them on local compliance issues affecting the sale of our product in their markets. It's often difficult then as a manufacturer to keep information on the end customer use or who the end customers are in every market. And since coming to Mate, again, many of our dealers have been with us for a long period of time, very willing to share information on our end customers. Some of them are not. Some of them are more closed, and they fear that if they give us their end customer list or share that, we might do something to contact that customer directly. So it is a challenge. You have to build that trust with your channel partners in order to get some of that very important end customer information to do your due diligence. And with our dealer meeting that we hosted with all of our dealers from Central and Western Europe this year, which included our dealers from Russia, again, sharing with them the importance of who we can and can't sell our products to. And the majority of that focus was on Iran. And when the EU recently lifted their sanctions pertaining to many products going into Iran, my phone in my office in Anoka was ringing off the hook with, okay, the sanctions are removed, we would like to buy your products to be able to bring them to our customers in Iran. And we had to have the conversations with them saying, you know, again, the EU lifted sanctions, the US did not. We're not allowed to sell into that market. And we had to reinforce that with our dealers, saying, no, that's still an area that we can't sell. And we used this very similar slide with the countries listed where we can and can't do business. Now, with the recent issue in Crimea, it did affect our distribution of products in that area. And we had to look at it from the end customer perspective and find out, okay, what channel would be acceptable, and had to switch from our Ukrainian dealer that had been servicing those customers to a subsidiary of our end customers located in Russia where we didn't have any issues affecting the sale and distribution of our products to that end customer. End customer didn't really like it much, but they understand it. And there were some tensions, obviously switching sales from one dealer to another, but there was no other choice for us in how we had to do that with being able to reach our customers. As far as fear or worry about doing business in that part of the world, we really have none. Russia was seen as a very important market for MATE. We've been doing business in that market the last 20 years. We did see a big hit economically and with our sales in 2014, as many industries did when the economies declined. And that was one of the driving forces behind our change in how we went to market. There were changes within our channel partner that directed us to look for different models of distribution due to that downturn. But it's still a very important market to MATE. Before the decline in 2014, it was a multi-million-dollar market for us. So being a small manufacturer out of Minnesota, Russia was one of our biggest sales targets. And it continues to be a growth market. We're seeing year-on-year growth from last year to this year, part of it due to our expansion in channel partners, but also because of a growing confidence within the manufacturing sector into which our products are sold. So it has been a good market. I would strongly recommend, if you're not selling there, to look at it as a manufacturer. My past experience in the building construction industry, again, we had great success selling that type of product to developments in and around the big cities. As Matt shared earlier, you have 15 cities with over 1 million in population in those areas. That's how we kind of looked at targeting our market for representation. Where did we want to go into? Where did we think the customer base might be for our products? And now at MATE, I operate through regional managers, one of which, mine in Central Europe, he's located in the Czech Republic. He speaks Polish, he speaks Russian, he speaks Czech. So I'm very fortunate to have somebody technically competent that can work in that local marketplace and converse in the local language. If it were up to me, I can say hello and greet them, and that's it. I'm not much use, but on the technical side, having a local representative of the company that's there to assist our dealers and do more of the due diligence work in cooperation with our dealers on the end customers, that has been the key to our success. So with that, I'll turn it over to
Thank
Leo.
you, Michael, very much. And now we'll turn to Leo Grichener from the U.S.-Russia Trade Association and for his perspectives.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank to Dr. Nikolai Megitz for organizing this forum and give me some opportunity to introduce a short facts about Russian community here in Minnesota. And I would like to express my personal comments as a vice president of RAPCO, or Russian Business Culture Association, which was established in 1995, and also as a publisher of the only Russian media in Minnesota, and doing business with like 25 years in Minnesota. And first of all, I would like to tell you that to make and to do business with Russia, it's very important indicator for relationship between United States and Russia Federation. And I am sure that a lot of companies, they ask question about how to do this business, and I completely agree that it's absolutely good to do business with Russia, and it will be a good opportunity and safe. And now I would like in few words just to give you information about Russian community here in Minnesota, because to do business with Russia, and it's good to know about a little bit information about Russian community. Russian community is in Minnesota is quite large. The community remains one of the largest immigrant group in Minnesota, and according to Minnesota State, it's like more than 45,000, but I believe it's much more because a lot of people. This is only official who claim that Russian is ancestry in Minnesota when it was asking for. So here, a majority of Russian community is high educated people and with significant job experience. And in our data, in our list, we have more than 2,000 businesses founded with Russian-speaking owners. They doing business here in Minnesota and also internationally over the sea. We have like 12 grocery stores. We have 4 restaurants Russian. We have a Russian medical clinic. We have famous Russian ballet, Academy of Russian Ballet. We have few Russian Orthodox churches. Also, we have Russian culture centers. We have Russian charter school. We have like more than 8 Russian adults daycares and Russian centers and culture and educational centers. We publish 2 newspapers every month. We publish Community Glassy magazine for Russian community, and also our main sources. We publish annually Russian directory. It's called like Russian Yellow Pages, and it looks like this. And it's a really good source for how to connect with Russian businesses, Russian market, and over the sea. And here a few words. I'll give you some samples how we connect with doing business with Russia, or how can we be kind of bridge or middleman between Minnesota companies and who is willing or going to do business with Russia. Like a couple months ago, we were contacted, Rabka was contacted by company in Russia. They tried to do business in Minnesota with company who sell, they are asking to buy equipment for hunting, for sports in facility, or the supplies. And they numerous times they contacted to company and no answer, nothing was. But what they did, they go to Google and they push like 2 words, Russian space MN, even not Minnesota. And always we come first. They contacted us, and thanks to, we called to this company, and in 2 days we connected them, because the main reason was this company, they saw that this is spam, or this is company, they have no idea, they have not introduced. And that's why I think we are very, very good source for communication, or to be between, like middleman or bridge, as I said before, between you and company. Another good sample, company in Minnesota, which they manufacture a very nice, innovative medical device called Arabella, and they asked us to introduce to Russian markets and to other Eastern European countries. And as a fact, our representative now in October, it will be a really good the Southwest Forum, and we will promote their innovative device products. So, by the way, in October, it's in the middle of October. So, in case if you are interested to promote your product, service, you have a really good chance. Ask us, and our representative will present or represent your company in this very big international forum. So by the end of my speech, I would like to tell you that we have a very good website and printing area, but our main source is like consulting and to be to support you and to help you. And especially I would like to reach out to Minnesota lawyers and legal services to help for establish business between Minnesota company and Russia. So many legal questions, and we are looking for this help. So please see me if you have any questions. I will be more than happy to answer you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you very much. And now finally, turn it over to Todd Lefko.
Thanks, Thomas. I handed out these sheets basically on, it's like a first sieve of what to think about when you're doing business in Russia. There's no perfect answer for this, basically, but it's the kind of things you should think about before you get in. As we say in Russia, once you've gotten your attorney and your psychiatrist set, then you're ready to do it. We are sort of the weird ducks. We do everything from import to export. We work both ways. We're bringing Russian companies into the United States. We're trying to set up a company in the United States now. It's with the third largest or one of the three largest spice companies in Russia, and get a portion of the American market. And we'll see whether people buy our laurel leaves and coriander and mustard and everything else. We also publish, and this is the newspaper I'm in, and this is Putin's paper. We're presidential paper. There's Putin, Erdogan, and me. There's what's called the unholy trinity in Russia. And fortunately, they're in different in different boxes that are here. But I've done this for 16, 17 years. So we've worked with a number of major companies. We've worked with Cargill for 7 years doing animal fats. We basically work with Penn Air now and a number of other large companies. We work with Scott Kilns, which is the largest kiln company. We basically worked with, I did the training for IBM on working in Russia. So we've worked with a number of good firms. Now, let me start off with the idea that Nikolai understood something that a lot of other people didn't. There's a weird inverse correlation between political trouble and interest in a place. As the political grief goes up, and one of the things we understand is that governments fight, but businesses and people get along okay. We can work out benefits or personal relationships that often governments have difficulty doing. And so what we've done is we start to watch, the idea that success is possible. Money is going both ways every day. That's a reality. When you've got 141 million people, when you've got people that have a large middle class, when you go to Moscow and you see the latest stores, all the latest Bentleys, every major firm which is there in the world, money is there. It may be more concentrated than it was before, and it's the question of gaining access to it, but it's there. And so the question is, as long as the market is there, one of the things that's happened is that the Americans have basically opted out of it. We've allowed a lot of other countries to move into a market that we could have controlled, and we chose by psychology or by fear often not to go into the market where we would have had a great advantage and where we have a lesser market and a lesser psychological and economic benefit or position than we did before. So you start seeing the idea that we've got challenges. That's a reality. On the pluses that basically, that Matt pointed out, and they're all real. The market is there, it's there, but they're with challenges. What you're seeing is the internal Russian market is becoming far more difficult and pessimistic right now. We don't have the benefits that a lot of other countries do. We can't do credit. We have the national expert on doing credit in the United States, here in Minnesota, and Kurt Hanson, who's sitting in the second row there. And if you're going to do any business anywhere except for Russia, because we can't use U.S. credit, unfortunately, talk to Kurt, because he is the expert. It's becoming more difficult. Much of the credit in Russia is cutting back. You're seeing greater competition. When you go to the Russian shows and you watch what used to be 4 booths over on the side that were Chinese, now they're the whole section. We fight with the Germans on the top and the Chinese on the bottom. And one of our partners was in Perm 2 weeks ago, and the guy was explaining to him, he says, not only can't we afford the American stuff, hell, we can't even afford the Chinese stuff. So the market is tougher, but it's there. And the question starts to be, is that even with the high end's getting tighter. And so what can you do that's different? Because what you do is you either come in on basis of technology and your uniqueness, the idea of price, or the idea of service. And the question is, if you're not fitting into some of those markets and doing something which is unique or different, the odds are that the market is fairly well developed and you're not going to be able to cut in. We had one of our guys with the valves we were selling said, look, I've worked with the Germans for 15 years. Their price is better than yours and their technology is as good as yours. Why should we switch to an American product? And unless you can answer the question, and I couldn't answer that question, unless you can answer that question, you're going to have a problem depending on it, unless you've got something that's unique in terms of the niche that's there. Secondly, is the idea of patience. Nothing in Russia happens quickly, but it can. Everything in Russia takes 5 minutes, 5 months, or 5 nevers, depending on who your relationships are. And the question is that this is a high-touch society. You go in, and a lot of business is done in kitchens, it's done in restaurants late at night, and it's done with the idea of, do you trust somebody? And believe me, if you'll know when the discussion turns to yes, shutka, yes, I have a joke, then you know you've won half the battle that's there, because the Russians are probably the funniest people in the world. But in fact, one of the skills you'll learn is you'll learn how to tell jokes, because in most cases you need that. So the question starts to be, how do you basically do something in a situation where there is growing anti-Americanism? If you're with a governmental firm, in a lot of cases, it's a question, they will choose a German firm or somebody else over an American firm. That's the reality, because not everybody loves the Americans. You know, we're down to 24% favorable and 61% unfavorable. Those I've mentioned to people, if Putin announced he loved the United States tomorrow, those figures would change dramatically. But the odds are he's not going to do that tomorrow or the next day, the way things are going. So the question is, there's little U.S. governmental support right now, though the truth is that you've got all kinds of informational support, the commercial attachés, the State Trade Department. You've got all these people that are experts here, if you ask them. You know, and the question is often we're too shy or now don't know which are the right people to ask. You know, there's a problem seriously now with the questions of visas. We're running at a minimum 85 days at best for tourism. And in reality, the U.S. Embassy, as we've just discovered, has stopped taking even requests for, you know, there's one place in St. Petersburg, as I understand this morning, that is still taking requests in. But the agencies that are handling this, so if you've got your partners coming here, that's a serious question. If you've got conferences or the idea of business, and a lot of business is done where what you do doesn't depend upon what you start with, it depends on what your relationships are. And somebody says, is it possible? At the Mojna, is it possible, you know, to do this? So next is the idea, we're watching the challenges, and the challenges from Crimea, we just went through a couple months with Pentair showing that none of our things would end up in Crimea. To prove that nothing will ever end up somewhere is more difficult to say that it'll never be shipped somewhere. Transshipment is a really tough issue. Once something gets to a place, you've lost control. You know, and the reality is that you can't always guarantee, because somebody can buy your product and then resell it. I mean, we had a situation, we were working in Dubai, and the parent company was in Tehran. And they asked me, can you do gas engines? I said, sure. And I said, but we can't do Iran. And they said, we understand totally. So I said, send me a fax, because those were the days when people actually used faxes. And they didn't take off the top of the sheet, which said Iranian Natural Gas Company. And I called them and I said, my desire to spend my declining years in prison is not as great as it used to be. And so we are no longer working with those people. But the question is that you do the question of both transshipment and the question of money sourcing. which become legitimate issues of where does money come from, because money often comes at a circuitous route. You know, and it may come through countries. They used to say that war was God's way of teaching Americans geography. Actually, bank routing systems are really the way that's happening, you know, in a current process. You're watching this idea toward a centralization of market. It is really difficult to tell. It's like people ask you, if you've got a private company, but the directors are appointed by the government, is it private or public? And the answer is definitely yes. It's a little bit of both. And the question is, as markets start to shrink and as the government takes over more and more sectors, especially in certain sectors, the government has more and more influence, so you don't have the multitude of people to buy or to sell to that you did before. And so the question becomes that of the question of blot, the question of influence. How much access to funding do you have? Which you may have a great market, but they can't get access through the banking system or to the government, especially if you're in areas like water or some of the public services. We've tried to move toward what we think is going to be the future. There are a number of Russian companies that have quality products that could sell across the world, and we're trying to do that with spices now. If there's anybody here who knows about CO2 extracts, please let me know, because I need somebody in that area right now, because we're trying to sell. Our Russian partners invented a new system there. You've got competition, which is serious reality. Things happen in Russia that never become public. All of a sudden, your competitors can undercut you by 15% because they don't pay taxes, because they paid off somebody in the government. That's reality. And so the question is that there's a good chance that physical or legal things will come up because you don't know what their contacts are. And this is something you have to be aware of, because we're in a competitive relationship where people have been paid off and people have, you know, and something that we don't do in the United States, and in 29 years we've never done it, but sometimes our competitors do. And that's become our reality of the world. And so the question becomes, the market exists. It's more difficult than it was before. If you have the patience, and if you have the ability and the financial ability to wait for a couple of years, because in some cases that's what you're talking about, and the ability to go back, and the ability to bring people here, and the ability to support your people, the market exists if you've got the guts and the patience.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks very much to our entire panel. And we have now some time to open this up for a general discussion, questions or comments. So the floor is yours. Anybody like to start? Yes.
This is for Michael and for Todd. So payment is obviously a big issue in Russia. So how actually does payments work? How does Mate Precision get their money from their dealers, or how does the dealer get the money out of Russia, or do they have money outside of Russia? Can you just elaborate on that matter?
I have a comment to panelists. Can you repeat the question, because we are recording this event and we need it for.
The question was, how do we receive payments from our Russian partners? And if it's a new relationship, we're doing cash in advance. And again, easiest way for us, U.S. manufacturer, to avoid risk, have them do wire transfers to us. So it does delay the payment, and sometimes we lose business because our customer might need our product immediately. And if we're waiting on the payment before we're doing production or that, we might lose an order because of it, but it eliminates our risk. As we gain experience with that customer, we build that credit history with them, we would go to net 30 terms. So the dealers that we've had on board for a longer period of time, we know that. We know they might have difficulty with the timing of their payment. So they may tell us, look, we've orchestrated the payment at the bank. And for us, because of the trust, we'll say, okay, we'll release the orders, we'll do production. We might not see that payment again, 4, 3, 5, 7 days, whatever it is. But we know based on experience that we will receive the payment. So again, as we built trust, have we been burned on that in the past? Yes. Most recently, no. But it's the easiest way for us to mitigate risk. Cash in advance for newer customers. As we build the trust, we go to open terms.
How easy is it for Russian companies to actually do the transfers Do they, I mean, in China, for example, you have to have a dollar account, or you have to apply for the right to send money out of the country, and it's gotten tighter there. I assume Russia would have some similar restrictions as well. It's not like they can just transfer as much as they want.
They have to have paperwork with the documentations or the right stamps on it. It seems to be easier for some of our bigger partners that are doing not only business with MATE, but with bigger partners that have bigger wire transfer or payment requirements than they do for ours. Ours are usually a smaller piece of their total business. And for those bigger customers, it seems to be a lot easier than the smaller ones that don't maybe have the financial strength within the bank.
Yeah, you've had a couple of factors. One is the question of whatever the ruble rate is at that moment, and if it shifts. Sometimes you'll make a yearly contract where the ruble drops or the dollar changes, and all of a sudden, what looked like good economics for the firm doesn't look like good economics. And so you either all change the relationship at that point, or you take a smaller amount as your profit. The other factor is the Russian government's cracking down, because so many people illegally transferred money out of the country before this, that you need far better documentation, in terms of what you're shifting. We don't give credit. All of our people understand, and this works on two sides, since we're working in between often Russian and American companies. The Russian companies understand that they're going to have to pay before production or before shipment, depending upon what situation you're in, and it differs from company to company. Secondly is the idea that Russia, because of the cachet of Russia, which often brings up a number of other images in companies' minds here in the United States, there's nothing that says love like providing money first. And they're much fuzzier and warmer towards you on doing business or on giving you credit. And what I mean is that the true level of trust. We operate off trust in a lot of cases, as Americans, because we've got legal systems that basically protect us. In Russia, you don't. You'll have contracts for everything, but try and collect from a Russian firm. We have contracts, but in reality, you base it on trust and handshakes. And if you don't trust those people, then don't do business with them.
And I will repeat the questions so the panel doesn't have to worry about that. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? I'll ask a question then. Describe the American community right now in Moscow. Has it been growing less because of the tensions, as you say, anti-Americanism? I mean, how does it feel being an American right now, doing business in Moscow? Todd.
At this moment, it depends upon how long you've been there and how your relationships are there. I think it's most difficult probably, and Matt, you'd probably know this better than I would, it's probably more difficult for the official members of the delegation and the diplomats than it is for business people. Most of us have built up personal relationships over the years where I'm the American grandfather, I'm Uncle Todd, I'm a member of the family for a lot of people. I go to private parties. Most of our things are in kitchens. I mean, we have a regular set of friends that we have, and we see our friends. And so it's friendship, even if we're not doing business with some of the people at the time. And a lot of people, our friends, we have no business with, because basically they're just our relations, they're our friends. And so if you're going in new, it's a little tougher than if you're going in as somebody who's been there, because you don't survive in Russia for 29 years if you don't have some relationships. I mean, that is the reality, just as in any country. And so it's easier for us because we've got set markets that we're working in, we've got set partners, and most of our partners, the people we go in with, we tend to work with for long periods. Because quite frankly, sometimes it takes you 3, 4, 5 years to really build up a market if something's new. Aeration Industries we've been working on for 5 years, and this week there's a meeting in Ulan-Ude to decide whether they'll try the product. The one in Kazan didn't work because they gave us the wrong information, in terms of the public entity, the waterworks there. And so the trick is to build up systems. The hardest thing is always the first thing. Once you've gotten something done and established the system, then it's not easy, it's just easier.
Can the Chamber of Commerce there help? I mean, are there institutions, American, in place that can help a person coming through in practical terms? Yeah.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
There is an American Chamber of Commerce in
Yeah.
Russia, the AmCham. They've got, in the neighborhood of 700 member companies. And, just to speak anecdotally about what I hear from them, and I was last over there in March and met with their president. They report that they, for the most part, they continue to have good access to the Russian government, to regulators, to the parliamentary committees. A little bit in contrast to what our diplomatic community faces, they're by and large not getting harassed. And obviously, because of the regulatory environment, it's more difficult for them to do business there. And that's sort of a sum vector. I'm sure you can find anecdotal cases where certain U.S. companies or executives have been given a hard time. But for the most part, if you're seen as just there to do business and not there to indulge in politics or foreign policy, then they generally treat you like they do other businesses. The American business community over there, I think, has gotten smaller over time. Part of that's a function of it being more difficult to do business there over the last 4 years, but also particularly among the larger corporations, part of it is really a natural evolution, whereas, if you went in 1992, you wanted Americans, or at least, your German subsidiary guys running that business. Now a lot of these companies have had Russians whom they've brought up through their channels into positions of trust in local management. And so, you don't have as many Americans over there.
Yes, Nikolai.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Currently, the Minnesota Trade Office is discussing internally idea of building trade mission from Minnesota with Minnesota businesses to Russia. We talked about St. Petersburg for 2018, summertime. I just would like to ask your opinion on the panel. What do you think? Is it a good idea, smart, or maybe we should wait for another 2-3 years before we put Minnesota companies, like 15, 20 Minnesota companies, put them on a plane and go to Russia? Or it's too risky, or it's a good or bad?
So a trade mission to St. Petersburg in 2018 of Minnesota companies.
Yes.
Would this be a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. Anytime you have that opportunity to go and build the relationships and build your channel network, it's an ideal situation. If you wait until maybe economically or politically it's ideal to go, you're too late. And we found that in these times, as things are tougher on the businesses, it actually gives us more of a chance to go in and build those markets in preparation for when things get better. So when we had the downturn in the economics in 2014, the biggest question was, are you going to pull out of Russia, or are you going to do less travel there? And the answer was no. And again, our customers might not be in a position because of the dollar-ruble rate or other things to be able to do business with us today, but they value the relationship. The fact that we were still there to offer guidance and help with their businesses, it really was a great opportunity to strengthen the relationship that we had. And now that things are getting more favorable, we're earning more of that business back from them. So, again, for me personally, a trade mission where I've already got distribution, it may not be as attractive, but for other companies looking at Russia saying, is this maybe a market I should look at? Absolutely.
Nikolai, I'm sorry, go ahead, Leo. Go ahead.
I think it's not a good idea, it's a great idea, because I think that this is it's only indicator to show how to do a relationship and how to build and expand your business. And in this, I would like to tell you that to do business in Russia, first of all, you have to do some homework. And as Todd mentioned about handshake, this is very important to do business in Russia. And of course, for trades, if you have like right people or do some homework before to go. I think it's absolutely great idea, and everybody can help you to do this. Pre-trade job to do this, but I think it's absolutely you have to do in case if you in your mind to do business in Russia, and I think we can help you.
You know, years ago, I went to somebody, one of the people I wanted to do, start a business in Russia. And the man looked at me and said, come back to me when there are no problems in Russia. And I said, when there are no problems in Russia, they won't need you. And he's no longer, well, we're not working with him. But what you see is the idea that when you go to Russian trade shows, 26 years ago, I'm sitting out in Yekaterinburg in the Urals, and there's one American sign, Ecolab, the only sign in English that's there. And I was very proud. I called my friend who was the vice president of Ecolab, and I said, I want you to know your people in the Urals are working, you know, they're okay there. But what you're watching is that when you go to trade shows now, you're seeing the rest of the world moving into the market. And so it's our stuff competing with a lot of places that we didn't compete with 15, 20 years ago, when Americans not only had a good cachet, but we were the only product that was considered quality across the world, and the rest of the world has developed quality products. Even the Chinese stuff that started off as copies, now they're doing their own research and they're coming up and they're still lower priced. So you can choose not to go, but that doesn't mean the market's going to be there. Now the question becomes, and it's always the question of, what is your product? Are you unique? Do you fit into a niche? And who are your competitors presently and potentially? Because the truth is, we still have I'll say one last thing here. Stuff from Pentair and Clack and some of the areas in water, they'll buy Chinese stuff, the copies that'll be crap and out of business and not working in a year for their customers, and buy American stuff for their own houses. So the market, we still have a good cachet. It's not as good as it was years ago, but American still means quality. So if you've got something that you can sell, what is your elevator speech? In 1 minute, how do you differentiate yourself from the rest of the market? If you can do that, you'd be crazy not to go. And use Gold Key, which is out of the Department of Commerce, which is probably the fastest way in, because the truth is that you never know who's going to be a good partner, even through Gold Key, until somebody delivers. Because if I had $1 for every person years ago who told me that their brother was a friend of Boris Yeltsin's, we now would all be sitting in Switzerland having this discussion.
Any question? I have one comment to make. Well, first question here.
I do have a question. So I heard from several of the panelists that a lot of the business that's done in Russia is done through dealers, distributors that are located in Russia or maybe in Western Europe. And so a question is, what level of compliance training, education do you offer to those dealers, distributors? What have you found as the comfort level in sort of helping to educate them, not only compliance with the economic sanctions, but sort of other areas? And then maybe from the enforcement side, does it help if there's an enforcement action where you see that the U.S. company has taken steps to, educate a dealer, distributor, and something may have gone wrong?
Question was, since many companies will be working with dealers and distributors in Russia and in Western Europe, what's the level of confidence one can have in these intermediaries? And is it a wise idea to perhaps engage in some training with these intermediaries, both on sanctions and other areas? And is this a help? Is this possible? First of all, is it a help for compliance issues to do this?
From an enforcement point of view, absolutely. Particularly if you're talking about a civil case or administrative errors that have been made and violations took place, a thorough compliance program is absolutely a mitigating factor. And I don't know if what you're talking about might be related, but another very important thing would be voluntary self-disclosures. Voluntary self-disclosures are when you determine on your own, your company determines you violated the regulations in some way. You can find further information on our website about that, but if you voluntarily self-disclose those violations to commerce, it's a great weight mitigating factor in how those violations would be resolved. And typically, I forget the exact statistics, but it's very high that voluntary self-disclosures are typically resolved with just a warning letter.
Excellent. Yes, see.
Can someone
Wait.
talk a little more about the Russian corruption in business?
Yeah.
I believe it's worsening. Is it? Can someone?
Question is regarding corruption in Russia, business corruption, and what the trend is right now. Is it in fact worsening, or what is the status right now from your experience?
Just two aspects. On Larry's point, there's two aspects that are here. One is the idea that your own due diligence. The best defense is a good offense, that you protect yourself as much as possible and show that you made every effort and it's better to do it in writing, because the truth is you do have discussions, but you've got no proof for the discussions when you're in corporations. We are approaching, we tell our partners that this is American law, and the problem is that they don't always receive that welcome information with a smiling face. And it's this idea, the Chinese don't ask them, the Germans don't ask them, or the Germans don't stress it, because the Germans often do it in different ways. And so it's your own protection on that. And we're approaching some of our other companies, and we're going to talk to them about this, about the reality of this, because it's serious for us. For us, it's the idea, we're in this business for a long time. We want to be in the business for a long time. And this is stuff that, you lose. The concept of reputation is really important in the United States, but it's not as important in other places. And so for us, keeping a good reputation is really important. On the question of corruption, the answer is yes. We don't do it. We get stuff to the border, and our partners take stuff in. And I won't go through all the nuances of this, but the truth is that often customs, which has changed in the last couple of years, it was fairly corrupt, where you'd bring in things based upon where your relationships with customs existed. That was reality, where sometimes you'd ship to a really weird port, and our stuff usually goes into Kotka, or in most cases to Kotka in Finland. And then the trucks come and pick it up. So it does exist. It exists more in a more frustrating style for the people in Russia. They've got to pay off people, and their mid-level bureaucrats. Corruption could be stopped immediately, because everybody knows who's doing what. Saakashvili did it in a very short period in Georgia, in terms of the police, and it's, I can go through this for an hour, but it's basically, it does exist, and it's more frustrating for them. Even the middle level and higher executives, the larger companies that have government ties, corruption's done a different way than it is for the mid-sized or for outsiders. Big companies, Cargill didn't pay it. 3M doesn't pay it. But for the middle-sized people, and working with some of the Russians do have to have pressures from government officials. And it may be the electrical inspector who says, you got a $5,000 fine because I see your wires are loose, or your restaurant is slowed down, or the tax police. You hire the tax police, you pay the tax police to come in and do audits on your opponents. That's reality.
Is it getting worse, Todd? Is it getting worse?
What?
The corruption. It is getting worse.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
No, but what's the trend line? You've been going there for 29 years.
The trend line is the Russian government is trying to rationalize a lot of systems. They're doing things where in the past, if a product came in, there were unique pricings often on what was listed because you were taxed based on pricing. The Russian government, and this I applaud them, is that they've got the computer listing of practically what every product actually sells for and what the normal markups are. And so, because they're trying to get a fair assessment, and they're trying to make sure that not a lot of money is shipped out of Russia with nothing coming back in. So the Russian government, a lot of the elements are very honest, and they're really trying hard to make the system better. You know, and it's frustrating for them too, because they're the ones who have to go through this, and they're losing money, or they realize that, I mean, Navalny, who's the alternative to Putin, who's probably not going to be allowed to run, has run on this idea of corruption, and it's the one thing that the Russians seem to understand as a united front. They may like Putin. Putin's running 81 to 83%, which is somewhat favorable, which is somewhat higher than any American politician. You know, and what they've done is they've realized that they've separated Putin from the systems.
So we have just a couple of minutes left. If there are any final questions, I have one final comment I'd like to make. But any last question?
We will have a time to continue our discussion after
Yes.
in the lobby.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Just comparing Russia to China, China is known for a lot of copying of products and everything else. What's the situation in Russia right now as far as, is that something you need to be concerned with? Is that there's, you know, especially if the Russian government decides we're going to domesticize more imports.
Good question.
Is there a push towards making, re-engineering products in Russia rather than just buying foreign products?
So the question is comparing Russia with China on the intellectual property issue of copying, especially now that Russia is pushing for more domestic production. Do you see a growing problem with intellectual property in Russia?
I would say it's been an ongoing problem with intellectual property. I know of a Chinese company today that makes a fairly good copy of one of our primary products. Again, they're not using the same tool steel or specific engineering in it, but if you took away the colors, they'd look identical. So it is a concern. Obviously, it's a concern not only with China, but with every country we go into.
Where you get into fights are things like components with customs, where, especially if you're doing something with a chemical compound like nitrogen or something that can be used for dual use, you get into serious questions of what's the component, what is the chemical composition, and these are intellectual property issues, those are proprietary issues, and so you try and give them ranges. You go through negotiations. I went through a negotiation for 6 months with Cargill, where they wanted 100% guarantee that no American cow ever in the future would have disease. And I said, I can do 99.9, I can't do 100. But on other stuff, you go through, and there's people that are doing games with you all the time, and so you do go through negotiations like that.
You have one more comment here? Yes.
Just on intellectual property, again, sort of a general comment based on what we hear from American companies. The overall IP situation in Russia has gotten better over the last 20 years, both in terms of the legal and regulatory infrastructure and in terms of how it's enforced. Russia is not a really low-cost manufacturing platform, so you don't see the kinds of or the volume of IP violations that you see in a place like China or some other places in East Asia. If your IP can be digitized, if it's actually something that involves copyrights as opposed to patents or trademarks, you do have a little more cause for concern. These guys are very, very savvy in the IT realm. The fact of sanctions means that there is more incentive for some companies to try and replicate stuff that they used to get from abroad but now have much more difficulty getting. The advice I would give is to don't assume that the IP laws and your patents and trademarks that you may have here in the EU or wherever will protect you. Russia is a member of several of the international IP conventions. Some of these are under the WTO, some are independent. But you need to get your products registered, and you need to research with whom you're dealing, and you need to, certainly just as you would with sanctions, you need to have a due diligence program to protect your IP. It's very important to your business.
Thank you very much. And above all, thanks to our four panelists for some really great insights. Thank you so much. Nikolai?
Thank you not only to the panelists, but for panel moderator. Thank you, Tom, so much. And our program ended because we have to give a room for another program after this right away. But please stay in the lobby and continue discussion. I know Matt and everybody is here available to answer your questions still. Thank you.